It happened just before midnight, not with a declaration, not with a warning on television, not with a speech from a podium. It happened in the dark, somewhere over the skies of Tehran, when the most powerful military alliance on Earth decided that 45 years of waiting was finally over. In the span of a single night, February 28, 2026, the world as we knew it was shattered, reorganized, and set on fire. A supreme leader who had ruled Iran with an iron fist for over 35 years was dead. 200 Israeli fighter jets had carved through Iran's airspace like the sky belonged to them. American bombers had obliterated Iranian naval headquarters and missile launch sites with surgical precision. And Donald Trump, sitting in the White House watching it all unfold in real time, was already writing his next post. But here is what no one is telling you clearly. Here is the part that gets buried under the breaking news alerts and the live streams and the political commentary. This was not a surprise. This was not impulsive. This was not an accident. This had been planned, mapped, tracked, and rehearsed for months. And when the moment came, every single target had already been marked. The CIA had been watching Khamenei move for months. They knew where he slept, they knew where he met, they knew where he would be when the first missile fell. This is the full story of Operation Epic Fury, and by the time you finish watching this, you will understand not just what happened, but why it happened, who is really in control now, and what is coming next that nobody is prepared for. Let us go back to the weeks before the bombs fell, because the most important part of this story is not the explosions, it is what led to them. For months, the United States and Iran had been in quiet, indirect talks. The subject was Iran's nuclear program, a program that, according to multiple intelligence sources, had advanced dangerously close to weapons-grade capability. Talks were held through Omani intermediaries. A second round had been scheduled in Geneva. Diplomats were cautiously optimistic. The world believed a deal was possible. It was not. Behind the scenes, Trump had already made his decision. He had watched the diplomatic window close week by week. He had seen the intelligence reports. He had spoken privately to Netanyahu, and he had quietly ordered the largest military buildup the Middle East had seen since the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Carrier groups moved into position, stealth aircraft were repositioned, intelligence assets were activated across the region. While diplomats shook hands in Geneva hotel lobbies, soldiers were already at the gates. Then, on the night of February 27th, the final signal was given. What followed was described by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, as, and I want you to hear this carefully, the most lethal, most complex, and most precision aerial operation in history. Not in the history of this conflict, not in the history of the region, in all of recorded military history. 200 Israeli Air Force jets struck over 500 targets inside Iran. American forces simultaneously hit hundreds of additional targets. The goal was not occupation. The goal was decapitation, the complete removal of Iran's military leadership, nuclear capability, missile arsenal, and naval power in a single, synchronized operation. Among the targets, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He had ruled Iran since 1989. He had survived assassinations, regime pressure, international sanctions, and decades of geopolitical warfare. He had outlasted multiple American presidents. He had outlasted kings and prime ministers and generals. He had built the most sophisticated proxy warfare network the Middle East had ever seen. Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi forces, Iraqi militias, all funded, armed, and directed from Tehran under his command. And on February 28, 2026, a single Israeli airstrike found his compound and brought it down around him. Trump confirmed it on Truth Social in the language only Trump uses. He wrote that Khamenei was one of the most evil people in history and that he was unable to avoid our intelligence and highly sophisticated tracking systems. He wrote that the operation would continue throughout the week, or as long as necessary. Netanyahu stood at a podium the same night and said, and again, listen to this carefully, this tyrant no longer exists. For 3 decades, he has been sending terror through proxies. This plan and program no longer exists. The man they called the Imam, the man who built an empire on revolutionary ideology and regional fear, was gone. But here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the story becomes something far bigger than one man's death or one nation's military operation. Because within hours of the first strikes, Iran did not collapse. It did not surrender. It did not fall silent. It fought back with everything it had. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched wave after wave of ballistic missiles and drone attacks across the entire Persian Gulf. The targets were not military installations in isolated desert zones. They were civilian airports, international hubs, the heart of Gulf commerce and travel. Kuwait International Airport was struck. Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi was hit. Dubai, the city that never stops, suddenly went quiet as authorities cleared terminals and scrambled to intercept Iranian projectiles. A fire broke out at the iconic Fairmont The Palm Hotel on the Palm Jumeirah. Smoke rose over the Verge Al Arab. The port of Jebel Ali, one of the largest commercial ports on Earth, had a birth-catch fire from falling debris. The UAE military reported that they intercepted over 137 ballistic missiles and nearly 200 drones in a single day. 137 ballistic missiles in a single day. Let that number settle in your mind, because that is not a military response. That is a country throwing its entire arsenal into the air and daring the world to stop it. Iran also struck American military bases in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It fired Iranian missiles at British military bases in Cyprus. Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq threatened to begin attacking American bases immediately. Houthi forces in Yemen declared a state of maximum readiness. In Pakistan, violent protests erupted outside the American consulate in Karachi. 9 people were killed, 50 were wounded. The anger was spreading beyond governments and into streets. And then there was the meeting that changed the political architecture of everything. While bombs were falling and diplomats were being summoned to emergency UN Security Council sessions, the world's attention shifted to a different stage, the table where Donald Trump and Xi Jinping had last spoken. Because China, in this moment of global crisis, did not stay silent. China did not abstain or issue vague statements of concern. China made a clear and direct move, and what that move signals for America's future on the world stage is something that should make every person watching this stop and think very carefully. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi stepped forward and called for an immediate cessation of military operations. China expressed what it described as high concern about the American and Israeli strikes. And behind the scenes, sources began to suggest that the Trump-Xi conversation, which had already been tense over trade, Taiwan, and technology, had just entered entirely new and dangerous territory. Russia followed. Condolences were extended to Iran. Statements of condemnation were issued. Moscow and Beijing, for the first time in this crisis, stood visibly and publicly on the same side, the side opposing American military action in Iran. This is no longer just a war between Israel and Iran. This is no longer a regional conflict that the world can watch from a safe distance. What you are witnessing is the beginning of a direct confrontation between two global power structures that have been building toward this moment for years. On one side, America, Israel, and their Gulf and Western allies. On the other, Iran, backed politically and strategically by Russia and China. And the question that nobody in Washington has fully answered yet, the question that keeps intelligence analysts awake at night, is how far Moscow and Beijing are willing to go. 3 American troops had already been confirmed killed in the Iranian retaliatory strikes. The IRGC announced its 6th wave of attacks. Iran declared 40 days of national mourning and promised, in the specific, careful language of a regime that knows it is now fighting for its survival, that it would not allow air raid sirens in the occupied territories and American bases to stop. The funeral of Khamenei was held at the University of Tehran. Tens of thousands gathered in the streets, some in grief, some in fury, some in quiet shock. But in other parts of Tehran and in the Iranian diaspora scattered across the world, there was something else entirely. There was celebration. There were Iranian flags and American flags held together in the streets of Los Angeles. Exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi called Khamenei the bloodthirsty despot of our time and said he had been erased from the face of history. Iran was not one reaction. Iran was a nation divided by decades of oppression, finally confronting the moment it had feared and dreamed about at the same time. And somewhere in all of this, in the smoke and the missiles and the grief and the celebration and the geopolitical chess moves playing out in real time, the world was asking a single question that nobody yet had the answer to. What happens next? The answer to that question is not simple. And anyone who tells you it is simple is either lying to you or does not understand what is actually happening. So let us break it down, layer by layer, because what comes next involves 4 different theaters of power, and all 4 are moving simultaneously right now. The first is Iran itself. With Khamenei dead, the Islamic Republic is operating on emergency protocols. An interim leadership council of 3 figures has been activated, led by President Masoud Pezeshkian. Iran's foreign minister announced that a new supreme leader will be chosen within 1 or 2 days. The institution of the supreme leader, the most powerful position in the Iranian system, has existed since the revolution of 1979. It has only ever had two occupants. Choosing the third in the middle of an active war, while missiles are still falling and the country's military command structure has been shattered, is not a political process. It is a survival exercise. 40 senior Iranian commanders were killed in the first 48 hours of Operation Epic Fury. The chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces was killed in Tehran. The defense minister was killed. The commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps was killed. The secretary of the Iranian Security Council was killed. The people who would normally lead a wartime response are gone. The people who would normally advise the supreme leader on military strategy are gone. What remains is a regime under catastrophic decapitation pressure, trying to project strength through missile barrages while its internal power structure collapses beneath it. And yet, and this is the part that analysts are watching most carefully, the missiles kept coming. The IRGC, even in the chaos of its leadership vacuum, continued to launch coordinated large-scale strikes. That tells us something important. The command and fire infrastructure for Iran's missile program was either not fully destroyed or had been pre-delegated to lower commanders with standing orders to continue regardless of what happened at the top. Iran built this system for exactly this kind of scenario. They anticipated decapitation. They planned for it. That is not a regime stumbling. That is a regime executing a prepared contingency. The second theater is the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. Every single Gulf state with American military presence is now inside an active war zone. The social and economic cost of this is immeasurable. Dubai, the financial heart of the region, is operating under a fog of uncertainty. International airlines have suspended flights. Insurance costs on vessels crossing the Persian Gulf have spiked. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, is now a military flashpoint. Trump posted that American forces had already destroyed 9 Iranian naval ships and largely obliterated the Iranian naval headquarters. He promised more would soon be floating at the bottom of the sea. The message was deliberate and calculated. America is not just fighting Iran's military. America is ending Iran's ability to project naval power in the Gulf for a generation. The question for the Gulf states is not whether they support the American operation. Most of their governments do quietly, even while they issue cautious public statements. The question is whether their civilian populations will hold, and whether the psychological cost of being directly targeted by Iranian missiles changes the political calculus inside Saudi palaces and Emirati boardrooms. The third theater is the global superpower equation, and this is the theater that frightens strategic thinkers the most. China and Russia did not fire a single weapon. They do not need to. Their power in this moment is not military. It is political, economic, and psychological. China controls supply chains that the American economy depends on. Russia controls energy flows that European allies depend on. And both nations are now watching America absorb the consequences of an open-ended military campaign against a nation of 90 million people in a region where every neighboring country is either an ally under threat, a neutral state being pressured, or a potential proxy for further conflict. The Trump-Xi dynamic is the fulcrum on which everything else balances. The two leaders had spoken in early February before the strikes in a conversation that touched on trade, Taiwan, and Iran's nuclear program. At that time, there were still diplomatic channels open, still the possibility of a managed de-escalation. Now, with Khamenei dead and Iranian missiles falling on Gulf airports, that conversation belongs to a different world. Xi Jinping is not mourning Khamenei. China's relationship with the Islamic Republic is transactional. Oil, trade routes, regional influence. What China is calculating right now is something far colder: how to turn American overextension into Chinese strategic advantage. Every dollar America spends on this operation, every soldier deployed, every ally strained, every barrel of oil disrupted, all of it feeds into a Chinese strategic patience that has been building for decades. Beijing does not need to fire a missile to win something here. It needs only to wait, to absorb, and to position itself as the responsible power that called for peace while America chose war. That is the message Wang Yi delivered at the UN Security Council. That is the message Xi is sending to every nation in the global south watching this unfold. And it is landing. Russia's role is different but equally calculated. Putin's condolences to Iran were not mourning. They were a signal to Tehran, to Washington, and to every nation watching, that Russia views this conflict as an extension of the same American unilateralism that it has been positioning itself against since 2022. Russia cannot afford to materially support Iran right now. It has its own war to fund. But it can provide political cover, intelligence cooperation, and a global counter-narrative that frames American action as destabilizing aggression rather than righteous deterrence. And that counter-narrative has an audience, a very large one. The fourth theater, and the one that matters most to ordinary people watching this, is the human cost. It is easy to talk about geopolitics and military strategy and power balances. It is easy to map missiles on a screen and count destroyed targets and analyze leadership succession charts. It is much harder to look at what is actually happening to human beings. In Beit Shemesh, Israel, 8 people were killed when Iranian missiles struck a residential area. 23 more were taken to hospitals. 6 people, not soldiers, not military targets, but people who lived in a city, were killed in a single strike. At Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi, an Asian worker was killed and 7 others were injured when an Iranian drone struck. At the Fairmont, the Palm in Dubai, 4 guests were injured. At ports and airports and military bases from Cyprus to Qatar, the debris of a war between governments was falling on people who woke up that morning with no expectation that the sky above them would become a battlefield. In Iran itself, the picture is more complex and more painful. Tens of thousands mourned in the streets of Tehran. The grief was real. 40 days of national mourning were declared, and alongside the grief, simultaneously in the same streets, there was something the government could not control and could not explain away. There was joy. There were Iranians celebrating in their homes, quietly at first, then in public spaces, the end of a man who had presided over the suppression of their freedoms for 36 years. There were people crying tears of grief and people crying tears of relief in the same country, on the same day, under the same sky filled with smoke. That is the unbearable complexity of what is happening. This is not a story with clean heroes and clean villains. This is a story about the weight of history pressing down on millions of people at once, and the terrible cost of the moment when that weight finally breaks something. There are things we do not yet know. We do not know who the next supreme leader of Iran will be, and whether that person will choose escalation or a negotiated path out. We do not know whether the IRGC's proxy network, Hezbollah, Houthi forces, Iraqi militias, will launch coordinated attacks that open entirely new fronts. We do not know whether Trump's off-ramps, the term he used privately when asked about alternatives, will ever be offered in a form Iran's new leadership can accept. And we do not know, perhaps most critically, how far China is willing to move from political opposition to material support for Iranian survival. What we do know is this: Trump told reporters that the operation was ahead of schedule. That phrase is either the most confident statement of military success in modern American history, or the most dangerous act of premature certainty in the middle of a war that has not yet shown its full shape. Because wars rarely end ahead of schedule. They expand, they mutate, they outlive the plans that created them. And this one, launched against a nation of 90 million, backed politically by 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council, with proxy forces spread across 7 countries, has more possible directions than anyone in Washington is currently willing to admit publicly. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stood before the Security Council and said something that deserves to be heard past the noise. Military action carries the risk of igniting a chain of events that no one can control in the most volatile region of the world. He was not defending Iran. He was not condemning Israel or America. He was saying what every serious strategist privately believes, that once a certain threshold is crossed, the map of consequences becomes impossible to read. Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born leader of the Catholic Church, stood in St. Peter's Square and appealed for the spiral of violence to stop before it becomes an irreparable chasm. The European Union called Khamenei's death a defining moment in Iran's history, and cautiously suggested it could become an opportunity for the Iranian people to shape their own future. Canada expressed support for the American operation. Pakistan erupted in protest. The world is not united. The world is fracturing along lines that have been forming for years and are now fully visible. This is the moment, not the beginning of the end. We do not know enough for that, but the end of the beginning, the end of the period where the conflict between America and Iran could be managed through proxies, sanctions, diplomacy, and controlled escalation. That era is over. What replaces it will be determined in the coming days and weeks, in the decisions made by Iran's new leadership council, in the private conversations between Trump and Xi, in the choices made by Gulf states caught between American military power and Iranian missile range, and in the streets of Tehran where a people are deciding, in real time, what they want their country to become. One man who has followed this story closely said something that has stayed with me. He said, "The hardest thing about watching history is that when you are inside it, you cannot see the shape of it, you only feel the weight." Right now, the entire world is feeling the weight. Stay close to this story. Follow every development, because what happens in the next 72 hours will define not just the trajectory of this war, but the architecture of global power for the next generation. And if you want to be among the people who understand it, rather than just react to it, you already know what to do. The world changed on February 28, 2026. It will never go back to what it was. The only question now is what it becomes. Stay watching, stay thinking, and do not look away.